Our topic tonight is the foreign policy of Czechoslovakia. Our guest, as you know, is the ambassador of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic to the United States, Mirosoav Houstecky. Dr. Houstecky is a graduate of the School of Political and Economic Sciences in Prague. He received a PhD, I believe, from that institution as well in 1953. He taught for a number of years at Charles University in Prague and then at the School of Political and Economic Sciences in Prague during the years 1950 to 64. He then pursued a career as a journalist, in a sense, I believe with the Czechoslovak News Agency in India first, 1964 to 69, and then as editor and department director general of that same news agency from 1969 to 1982. He joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in It'd be nice if we could move back in time. A lot of us would like to do that. He joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1983. He served his nation as ambassador to Great Britain for 3 years before being appointed ambassador to the United States in 1986. As I mentioned, our topic tonight will be the foreign policy of Czechoslovakia. The ambassador will place the current foreign policy in historical perspective, and he will point toward those contemporary policy questions which he thinks would be of greatest interest to the audience. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you the ambassador of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, Mirosoav Houstecky.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Director Barrett, Mike. Distinguished members of Board of Trustees and distinguished guests. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to have the opportunity to address the members and guests of such distinguished body as Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs is. Since I have assumed the office of Ambassador of Czechoslovakia in the United States, I have visited Baltimore several times at different occasions. I can assure you that I have been returning to this beautiful city always with great pleasure. I do not hide that there is another reason for that. Many Czechs and Slovaks who left my country decades ago and arrived to the United States found the new home in Baltimore. They too left their mark on what this great city is today. Well, in my introductory remarks, I would concentrate on 3 points. The first point would be the comparison between the international position of Czechoslovakia as it is today with the situation as it was between the First and Second World War. The second point would be how Czechoslovakia reacts to the changes in the Soviet Union. And the third point would be the approach of Czechoslovakia to topical issues of international relations, especially those concerning Europe and disarmament. I have prepared for me a rather long speech, but I am afraid I wouldn't have such good contact as I am used to have. So I would prefer to speak by heart, and you will excuse me if my English sometimes will not permit me quite perfectly to express myself. Well, the first point, I think, although you won't agree with many things what I will tell today, I hope you will agree with the definition of the purpose of foreign policy of any country. As I see it, the foreign policy of every country has to provide such alliances for the country as to guarantee its independence, as also to prepare the best ground for economic cooperation and political cooperation with other countries, so that we can prepare also best conditions for improving the living standard of the people. Having this in mind, the leaders of Czechoslovakia, just after Czechoslovakia came into being, after 300 years being subjugated by Austrian-Hungarian Empire, it means between 1620, after the Battle on White Mountain, till 1918, when Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed. So since 1918, when Czechoslovakia came into being, it was a very difficult task for our leaders like Thomas Garrick Masaryk or Edvard Beneš, who was foreign minister, to shape the foreign policy in such a way that the independence of Czechoslovakia was safeguarded. There were two main pillars of their efforts to achieve that goal. The first pillar was the alliance of Czechoslovakia with France and the good cooperation with Great Britain, although this was not formally embodied in some formal alliance treaty with Great Britain. But there was alliance treaty with France in 1924 and then again in 1935. Well, the second pillar, the purpose of the alliance with France was to safeguard Czechoslovakia against possible aggression from Germany. The second pillar was the formation of a Little Entente. It means alliance of Czechoslovakia with Yugoslavia and Romania. Each one of the members of this Little Entente has its stake in this alliance. We wanted to be protected against revisionist attempts by Horthyst Hungary and Austria. The same was concerned as far as Yugoslavia and Romania is concerned, in the case of Hungary. Well, when you look at these attempts of our leaders, as we say, in the period of the First Republic, as we call it, so both pillars slowly but surely were collapsing. Why? As far as Little Entente is concerned, there were serious economic contradictions between the structure of Czechoslovak economy, because Czechoslovakia was highly industrially developed already during this period, and between Yugoslavia and Romania, which were predominantly agricultural countries. There were sharp contradictions because in Czechoslovakia we had also very formidable agriculture, and there was a very great competition of Czechoslovak agriculture with those of Romania and Yugoslavia. So that there was some internal bond between Czechoslovakia, economic bonds, ties between Czechoslovakia, Romania and Yugoslavia. In the 30s, both in Romania and in Yugoslavia, some pro-fascist elements slowly but surely came into prominence. And they had other interests than to foster the alliance with Czechoslovakia. As far as the second pillar is concerned, it collapsed tragically in 1938, when both France and Great Britain agreed in Munich with dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. So this was the end of the affair. The First Republic, as we have called it, collapsed. And with it also the alliances with the Western countries, with France and with Great Britain. Mind you, even President Beneš, who by any stretch of imagination was some leftist politician, neither social democratic, he concluded that perhaps in the interest of pure national survival, there is no other choice except fostering the alliance with the Soviet Union. And this is why in 1943 he concluded the alliance agreement with the Soviet Union. Furthermore, I would say that it was mainly due to the Soviet Union when Czechoslovakia was liberated in 1945. I am saying that only because you better understand, that not only communists or some other leftists in Czechoslovakia, but overwhelming majority, if not 100%, I don't say 100%, hardly you can achieve it in politics. But if I say overwhelming majority, then I am really right. Of the population in Czechoslovakia agreed that the alliance and cooperation with the Soviet Union is the best orientation in our foreign policy in this turbulent world as it was shaping after the Second World War. Naturally, when also we started building up socialism in our country, and when Europe during the Cold War was definitely divided into two socio-economic systems, when NATO was formed in 1949 and Warsaw Pact in 1955, so that Europe was divided also into two military blocs, naturally it was very difficult to decide whether you remain neutral or not. Our position was firmly in the camp of the socialist countries. Now it seems that the situation, of course, is slowly becoming different. We do not prefer anymore to speak strictly about the division of Europe into two blocks. No, we speak more and more about Europe as a common home of all European nations. And inherited in it means that we want to develop more and more cooperation in all the aspects, in the diplomatic dialogue, economic cooperation, and also issues concerning human issues, human rights. If I compare again the international position of Czechoslovakia as it was before the Second World War and now, so just I would like to remind you, position of Czechoslovakia, look on the map and you will see Czechoslovakia right in the middle of Europe. Geographical center of Europe is exactly in Bohemia, western part of Czechoslovakia. Yeah? During those days, between the First and Second World War, we had only a very small portion of our frontier with a friendly country, and that was Romania. On the west, we had very hostile Germany, especially after 1933, when Hitler came to power. Then there was Austria, which could not forgive us, that we helped very much to destroy Austrian Empire, especially during the First World War. Then you had Hungary, a semi-fascist regime. Poland, yeah, a very unrealistic dictatorial regime of Pilsudski and then Rich-Migli. So really there was only a very small portion of the frontiers which we could call friendly, and that was the Romania. Now we have, borders with German Democratic Republic, which is a friendly country, with Poland, was Polish People's Republic, with the Soviet Union, with Hungarian People's Republic. Austria is neutral. We have very good relations with Austrian Republic. And even with West Germany, with Federal Republic of Germany, we now conduct much better business than we did some, let us say, even 7, 8 years ago, not to speak about the situation some 15, 20 years ago. So I dare to say that never the international position of Czechoslovakia was as strong as it is today. Never were the rights of Czech and Slovak nations so firmly guaranteed, safeguarded as they are today. Well, the second point, what I would like to say. Hardly a day passes, dear guests, when you cannot read some article, some commentary, some news in the newspapers about what is going on in the Soviet Union or what's going on in other socialist countries. Really, what has been started under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union has far-reaching consequences, not only for internal politics, for economic situation in the Soviet Union, and for that matter also for their foreign policy, but it has really far-reaching consequences, and it will have still in neighboring states, in the socialist countries, and I think in the whole world as far as the shaping of international relations is concerned. When you read the newspapers, especially, I would say, when all these reforms were announced and Soviet Union tried to implement them, you read in the newspapers some guessing that some socialist countries are following very closely what's going on, not only following, that they are trying to implement it with all their strengths, sincerely, you see, whereas some other countries were very hesitatingly approached the changes because for some reasons they had to be afraid of what was going on there. So that the socialist states, the smaller socialist states, were divided into two categories, as you like to call it, some bad guys, good guys. Bad guys, Hungary, Poland, which very persistently wanted to follow Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, whereas such countries like Czechoslovakia and German Democratic Republic, for some reasons were afraid of doing so. I think now already the situation is a little different. I don't remember when I read it last time in American newspapers, whether it was New York Times or Washington Post or Washington Times or some magazines or Baltimore Sun. After, some exchanges of visit, both of Gorbachev in Czechoslovakia and our leaders in the Soviet Union, I think it has become clear that Czechoslovakia, with all its experiences, yes, also understands very well that once we want to improve the functioning of the socialist state, of the national economy, and again raise still more the living standard of our people, so we have carefully not only to follow and admire what's going on now under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, but to implement it also in Czechoslovakia. One thing I would say, you see, what you should realize always when you speak about these changes. We should realize that the conditions in each one of the socialist country is a little different. They have many things in common, but many things are also different. They differ from each other. And I think even the State Department now doesn't approach, as it used to call this Eastern Europe. So it doesn't approach it as one homogeneous entity, not at all. They approach each one of the socialist states separately because they know they have their own history, they have their own traditions, they differ for this or another reason from each other. So this is very important, what you should realize. Some of the measures which are being implemented in the Soviet Union is not wise to implement literally in which one of other socialist countries. I am not saying so that something is pleasant for us and something is unpleasant. This is not a question of being something pleasant or unpleasant. The issue is, if it is useful to be introduced, to be implemented in either in Poland or in Hungary or in some other countries. Yeah? Whoever of you visited Eastern Europe, so you know very well that the conditions in Poland are different from those in Czechoslovakia. In Poland they have a very, very, very strong, I don't know, I may say still 4 times, 5 times, very strong Catholic Church, whereas this is not the issue in Czechoslovakia. Yeah? In Poland, they have mostly private agriculture, whereas in Czechoslovakia we have about 94, 95% of land, either state farms or collective farms. The little different situation is Hungary. The democratic traditions in Czechoslovakia are very strong. Very strong, there is nothing new for us. And so if you take one issue after another one, you will see that these countries, although they have many things in common, they also differ from each other. And this is what I have in mind when I say, okay, we will implement whatever is good in the Soviet Union, but we must always take into consideration our concrete position in Czechoslovakia. The third point what I would like to say. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the approach of Czechoslovakia to some of the topical issues which are of great interest not only to you but to, I would say, everybody in Europe and throughout the world. You know very well what happened last December in Washington. You know very well, you are very well aware of great significance of the treaty signed by President Reagan and Gorbachev, treaty concerning elimination of two classes of nuclear weapons. For the first time in history, when the whole class of weapons is to be eliminated. Never before that happened in the history of mankind. You remember, we from older generation, how long the disarmament negotiations were held before the Second World War. Since the 20s, almost till the Second World War broke out. Once Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Litvinov, said in one of his famous speeches in Geneva during the disarmament conference, we are talking and talking about disarmament, we have achieved so far nothing, and it might very well happen that we become, all of us sitting here, the witnesses of the outbreak of the new war. He said so in 1934. So I again repeat, you know, this treaty signed by President Reagan and Gorbachev has a historical significance. Never before has the mankind achieved something like that. We consider this treaty to be only the first step for the achievement of further treaties concerning both nuclear as well as conventional weapons and conventional forces. What is on the agenda now? You know very well that State Secretary Schulz is leaving after a couple of days Washington, and he is going to have very important talks between 21st and 23rd of February in Moscow with his counterpart, Minister Shevardnadze, about the preparations for the next Moscow summit, which somebody says will be held at the end of May, somebody says at the beginning of June. I would say at the beginning of June, for some reasons. On the agenda is, first of all, the negotiations on 50% reduction of strategic nuclear forces. With whomever you talk in Washington, he will give you different ideas of his own. Somebody, when he is a little more optimistic, he will say, well, this treaty can be achieved, can be signed. Others are pessimists, and they say no, they rule out completely, impossible. You will meet also realists. He will tell you what speaks in favor, what speaks against. You see now how both the Americans, officials, diplomats, politicians, senators, representatives, and on the other hand, the Soviets very carefully follow the procedure ratification procedure in the Senate's committees, in different Senate's committees. Every word, what is being said there concerning verification or other aspects of the treaty, aspects of the bilateral relations between the USA and the Soviet Union, is very carefully evaluated. Why? Because it plays a very significant role in elaborating the new treaty on 50% reduction of nuclear forces, strategic nuclear forces. You know very well how difficult it was to achieve verification, to agree upon the verification of INF Treaty, and to achieve verification, procedure, inspections on the spot and so on, about strategic nuclear forces is still much more difficult than it was in the case of INF. And there are some other hurdles, you know. There are other issues connected with that treaty which play a very, very important role. And immediately I should say what I have in mind is, whether you like it or not, it has interconnection with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or I would put it other way around, the observance of ABM Treaty signed in 1972, which would put some limit on Star Wars, so on launching the military competition to the outer space. Well, this is, you see, on the agenda during Mr. Secretary's talks in Moscow, as I said, between 21st and 23rd of February. And as we see it, what should be also on the agenda, not only between the Soviet Union and the United States, but in the international community, is also total ban on nuclear test ban treaty, total ban on nuclear tests, then achieving the accord on total ban and elimination of chemical weapons. This seemed to be very promising last year. But excuse me saying that since the middle of December, it was decided here in the United States to start the production of binary chemical weapons, and to start the production, it already started, and to start the production of chemical bomb, which is going to start in 1990. It has little complicated the issue of negotiations on total ban on chemical weapons and their elimination. But still, when I read some interviews and speak with the Soviets, they didn't lose faith that in spite of that, the negotiations should continue, and I am sure they will be also the subject of Moscow negotiations. And let us see what can be done as far as this issue is concerned. We would prefer, on our side, in the East, to achieve the 000. You know, 00, we already have achieved as far as nuclear forces in Europe is concerned, land-based missiles. But United States and your allies, first of all, France and Great Britain, are strongly against having any negotiations on tactical nuclear weapons, or battlefield, as they are called, battlefield nuclear weapons. Because you say you need them in case we start great invasion to the West with our tanks, when we have supremacy, thousands and thousands and so on. And so you need these battlefield nuclear weapons. All right, we take it into consideration and say, all right, let us not discuss for the time being battlefield nuclear weapons. Let us discuss the reduction of conventional forces and conventional weapons. We agree that there is asymmetry. There is asymmetry. So let us discuss how to reduce different types of conventional weapons and conventional forces. But at the same time, we have to discuss about the type of weapons which are of dual capability, if I'm correct. I don't know how to express it in English. Such type of weapons like cannons, which can use both conventional shells and nuclear. So these are type of weapons of dual use or dual.
Okay, fine.
Yeah? You understand. Again, there are some hesitations if your side should discuss it in the framework of the negotiations on conventional forces and conventional weapons. We say, okay, so let us discuss about these weapons of dual capability, but as far as this nuclear shells is concerned, it will become a part of separate negotiations. So there is some, we are trying to find some compromise. When we agree, friends, with what you are saying, that there is a imbalance in some sort of nuclear forces in Europe, that Warsaw Pact has supremacy in tanks, in artillery, and I do not know in what else. We say, yes, we have. It is due to the historical developments of our forces. But on the other hand, you have to admit that in other type of weapons, you have the supremacy. It's right. You know, you ask your generals, how many more you have helicopters, which are equipped with anti-tank cannons? How many more you have another types of anti-tank weapons, which you have to take into consideration when you will put the numbers of our tanks, let us say 20,000, I don't know if it is true, maybe. I think it is difficult, you see, for politicians and for diplomats to be involved in serious discussion about this issue. It is a typical example when, under the directions of the politicians, diplomats, the governments, the generals must sit down to the table. They must put on the table all the cards and speak frankly. Okay, we have such and such number of tanks. We have such and such type, so many of artillery. We have so many fighter planes, fighter aircraft, interceptors. You have so many interceptors, fighting aircraft or helicopters, and so on and so forth. And we should not be guided, you know, with our effort to make up in every type of weapons the other side, but on the contrary, to reduce it to a level, and this is very important, what now Gorbachev is trying, you know, to convince the other side, and we too, to such a level which is reasonable, which is sufficiently reasonable for defense. This is a new idea for defense. What is enough for defense? I will tell you one example, see, which directly doesn't concern what I'm speaking right now, but indirectly I can give this example. You will understand that. The Soviet government requested the scientists of Soviet Academy of Sciences, what it would mean, reasonable sufficiency, even in nuclear capability for the Soviet Union. And the scientists told the government that 5% of the nuclear capability would be enough to protect the Soviet Union or to give the proper answer to the adversary. Imagine, 5% would be enough. So the similar should concern also the conventional weapons and conventional forces. Let us reduce it after I agree. Nobody would be, foolish enough to decrease, you know, to limit the forces without taking into consideration all the aspects of that very difficult issue. but let us reduce it to the reasonable sufficiency. That is why we have also offered the NATO country, let the commanders of both military pacts meet, let them discuss what is to be done, so that both of us will consider the military strategies, military concepts of both pacts, not aggressive, not offensive, but purely defensive. It will take time, but you will see that the discussion will start. You will see. Well, I am also quite sure that we will start, maybe this year, maybe next year, but I dare to say not later than next year, the talks between the NATO countries and member countries of Warsaw Pact about these conventional imbalances. I am sure that we will start serious negotiations. I am sure that at the end of Vienna follow-up meeting, in the final agreement or final document, something like that would be embodied, that giving mandate to some sort of conference, I cannot say precisely what, that is why I say some sort of, because this is being discussed now. This should be, you see, contained in that mandate for the countries concerned. Some mandate for negotiations on reducing these imbalances, reducing the conventional forces and conventional weapons in Europe, of course, under very strict verification procedures. Because this can last for quite a long time, we suggest that perhaps just in order to achieve more confidence in Europe, we should start with the reduction of such type of forces and weapons which are considered to be offensive in its nature. It means on the line of contact between Warsaw Pact and NATO, right in the middle of Europe, it means between the West Germany and GDR, between Czechoslovakia and Federal Republic of Germany. Let us reduce such type on both sides, such type of weapons which are aggressive by its nature, which are of offensive nature. And one thing is quite clear, if we achieve that there will be much greater confidence and much better conditions for further talks about improving the relations in Europe and about greater confidence, I would say, in the whole world. Czechoslovakia, in cooperation with German Democratic Republic, in order to achieve the same greater confidence, and as a first step, not as a last step, as a first step, we proposed to transfer the Central Europe in a zone without nuclear weapons and without chemical weapons. And I again underlined as a first step, as again, in order to create better understanding and prepare the ground for the successes in negotiations on other aspects of disarmament. Well, dear friends, I think I have spoken quite a long time, perhaps longer than I expected and than I wanted. So, in one of my speeches some days ago, I have finished my speech saying, well, you have listened tentatively. They started smiling. Then I realized that I made mistake. So you were listening attentively. And for that, I am very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for a very comprehensive introduction and discussion of the foreign policy of your nation. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions, as is our norm, until 10 minutes after 7. If you'd rejoin us, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I want to thank you for a very well-informed, very candid or honest presentation. My question relates to, I suppose, the experiences I had in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the summer thereof, when Dubček was the leader of Czechoslovakia. And I wondered if you could comment on any similarities between Mr. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika and Dubček's policies in Czechoslovakia at that time.
The question is whether you would, Mr. Ambassador, comment on any similarities between the policies in 1968 of Mr. Dubček and the policies today of Mr. Gorbachev.
There is one similarity, and that's end of it. The similarity is that the reforms which are to be implemented are very important reforms, and they should help to improve the economic efficiency and to expand socialist democracy. And this is what once Gorbachev also exercised, implement in the Soviet Union, and that is exactly what we wanted also to implement in Czechoslovakia. Decisions which we adopted at the beginning of the year, 1968, were correct. There is nothing to be ashamed of. Unfortunately, we had leaders which were not, as you say, up to the mark. And everybody perhaps knows Dubček, but he was type whether you like it or not, but just think over it. There is a difference between politicians. When the things are going quite well, when there are no crises, when the economy is in the upward trend, when the majority of the people are quite happy, it's not so difficult to be leader of the country. But when it comes to the crisis, when it comes to the stage when you have to implement something what is very substantial, what concerns the whole structure of the economic management, and when you want to implement what we call in our condition socialist democracy, you know, and you feel it's not difficult, it's not so easy, that you have very different ideas, and you have also some enemies who have completely different ideas, and he want to use it as they see it would be the best, as they see it. Then, you know, it's the time for politicians who can steer their ship in the stormy weather. And Dubček was not that type. He was very weak. He didn't know what to do. Once he wanted to be very firm in the decisions. Next day he listened to somebody else, and he was very, very weak. He changed completely his mind. One day he was weeping, another day he was crying on others. Well, so this was the situation. And because we had bad leadership, you can explain it how do you want. And I am very happy that the Soviet Union has such formidable leader as Gorbachev is. I don't think he will permit anything, you know, going from one side to another one. You cannot afford that in politics. You cannot even afford that in the United States. And you don't have in great esteem politicians who is weak and who is weeping when there is no time for weeping, when you must be very firm. You have become responsible for the whole nation. So we have the right to ask you to steer the ship to better future. He was not capable of doing so. Yeah.
Yes, sir, in the rear.
Mr. Ambassador, many of us here in Maryland are Catholics. You mentioned your population of Catholics at home. Unfortunately, your government has allowed the 14 dioceses of Czechoslovakia now by block the ordination of new bishops for those dioceses to the point where there are only 3 bishops left in all of Czechoslovakia. You spoke very glowing words about Glasnost. When will we see this horrible persecution of Catholics in Czechoslovakia end? When will they have bishops?
Very courageous question. You will see once Vatican will agree also with our opinion. We are responsible for Czechoslovakia, not Vatican. You see, even in pre-war Czechoslovakia, Vatican, once it's wanted to appoint bishop in any part of Czechoslovakia, in diocese, they had to consult Czechoslovak government. It was always the outcome of the common negotiations. This is what Vatican is somehow unwilling to do. We are conducting negotiations with Vatican. There is no persecution of Catholic Church. You visit Czechoslovakia, you visit any church you want, and you will see people offering prayings, and nobody prevents them in doing so. Our churches in Czechoslovakia are in much better shape than some churches in other countries, because it is the state, it is the government which pays for all the repairs of the Catholic churches. So what I am saying is, we don't have, as you think we have, some strong conflicts with Catholic Church. We don't have. You are mistaken. As far as the seats which are not occupied by bishops, we discuss about that with Vatican very calmly, openly. Yeah. Very often I got the message from Prague that our delegation visited Vatican. Very recently, delegation from Vatican visited Czechoslovakia. But one thing must be clear, my dear. Vatican is not here to dictate anybody. It has to respect also the view of the government, which is responsible for the population of Czechoslovakia. That's all.
Yes, sir.
You indicated that there were several, or perhaps many, policies of reform that the Soviet Union is attempting to implement, as well as some perhaps that your neighbors in Hungary have implemented that would not work in Czechoslovakia. Could you give some examples of perhaps some reasons why you believe those policies wouldn't work?
I'll repeat the question. The question was, you had mentioned that there were some reforms which were being implemented in Poland, for example, and elsewhere, which perhaps didn't apply to Czechoslovakia or wouldn't work there. Would you give some examples of those reforms that you think wouldn't work, and perhaps explain why you think they wouldn't work?
This is difficult for me to answer, because once I touch upon the policy of Hungary, I would it's difficult for me to comment. I think what is good for them, they are trying to implement. What is good for us, we will implement in our conditions.
I think he would like one example, perhaps.
One example. In the Soviet Union, they don't have any other political party except Communist Party, whereas we have several political parties. So we don't want to repeat the example of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Stern?
Mr. Ambassador, in your first reply to the first question, you talked about the different characteristics of politicians. So let's do a little what if. What if there had been a Soviet leader with Mr. Gorbachev's mentality instead of Mr. Brezhnev's mentality in 1968? Do you think the history of your country would have changed, and do you think it would have changed for the better?
The speculative question is that if the Soviet Union had had a leader of Mr. Gorbachev's inclinations and qualities in 1968, would it have affected the future of your country, and if so, would it have been for the better?
The history doesn't know if.
Sometimes the academician will speculate about the I'm not sure the ambassador will. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, I understand there's about 25 engineers from your country and about 1,000 laborers working on an old pipeline from Iran into Russia. That's one thing. The second thing is, you talked about nuclear weapons. Are they going to remove the SS-20s that they have in your country out, which amounts to about 40?
I'm not I think you want the ambassador to simply comment on his foreign nationals who are working on the pipeline, first of all, and then secondly on whether the SS-20s are going to be removed from your territory.
Yeah. This is a better question than the others. Thank you. You want to give me some more complicated? Yeah?
I happened to be in Europe at the time that the Warsaw nation circled Czechoslovakia. And it was not your country, but it was another country. And I got into the cab to go to dinner. And the cab driver said, "What do you think?" I said, "Mr. Ducek is crazy because he's not fooling around with the United States. He's going to be killed." And that's exactly what happened.
He was quite well, you see, and he's living maybe much better than you do. All the happenings in Czechoslovakia, if I may say so, after 1968, although in some individual cases might have been tragic, but nothing happened to anybody. Nobody was liquidated. Nobody was sentenced. Nobody was put before the court and sentenced to 5 years, 7 years, not to speak about some death sentence. Not at all. Whereas I can give you some other examples where at similar occasions, many people died. They were killed and later on rehabilitated and so on. This was not the case of Czechoslovakia. Everything was corrected by political means, although it might have been for some people individually crucial. Well, going back to that question, there are, to my knowledge, no workers, Czechoslovak workers, working on the pipeline between Iran and the Soviet Union. There are Czechoslovak workers who are building up the pipeline on the territory of the Soviet Union, of the crude oil and for gas coming from the Soviet Union either to Czechoslovakia or through Czechoslovakia to West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and part of that as a sort of repayment, we are getting also a portion of that crude oil or gas. That's my answer, the first question, and the second one concerned SS-20. No, there were none SS-20s, neither on Czechoslovak territory nor on GDR territory. There were only displayed on Soviet territory, in the western part of the Soviet Union. On Czechoslovak territory, there were exactly 39. Ask your generals, they will confirm that. They know that very well. There were 39 altogether. And the Soviets called them SS-12 or SS-13, I don't know exactly how, something like that. I think SS-12. So they are 39 exactly, and you can read it in the protocol attached to the INF treaty signed by President Reagan. Do you think that he will sign something what is not correct?
We won't get into partisan politics tonight.
Well, excuse, I will finish.
Yes.
So, our foreign minister, with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and Foreign Minister of German Democratic Republic, they signed special protocol which is part and parcel of INF treaty, promising that these weapons will be withdrawn and the Americans, because it concerns purely Americans, will have the right at any time visit and check up if the missiles had been really withdrawn from Czechoslovak territory. Whoever visited Czechoslovakia, I can tell you the place where they are. Go and look upon them. They are 79 and the city of Hranice in the middle of Moravia. It's no secret.
Yes, sir.
There are today several hundred thousand Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia. Do you see this as being in Czechoslovakia's own national interest?
Would you comment upon the degree to which Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia are in the interest of your nation?
They are there in the interest of our nation as long as the situation in Europe will be as it is. If it improves, perhaps there will be a chance to discuss about that. Anyway, the treaty which was signed speaks about contemporary stay of the Soviet troops. There are maybe, I don't know again exactly, I can only say what I have heard, some 70, 80,000 Soviet troops. If they are 120, they are not, I think, but it doesn't matter. But what matters is that there is a treaty only about contemporary stay of the Soviet troops, and I think if the situation improves, well, it would be different, maybe.
First, Mr. Rich.
Mr. Ambassador, if I'm not mistaken, the normal head of the Russian hierarchy had 3 titles, did he not? 3 titles? Like Stalin had 3 and Gorbachev, the ones before Gorbachev. I understand he is the Secretary General, is that not right?
Gorbachev? Yes, he is.
But he's not the Secretary of the Communist Party. Am I right?
He is Secretary General of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
No, there's 3 titles, I believe.
No,
I
1.
understood he only has 1.
Yes,
Yes,
that is what I have said.
it sounded a little different.
Uh,
Not that long.
He's
My point is this, it makes me wonder if he's going to see July the 1st, because I feel that he's on very tender ground. If he makes one real error, I think there's enough of the old hierarchy there that'll just dump him fast and furious. What's your feeling?
The question is whether you would like to venture to comment on the tenuousness of Mr. Gorbachev's political position in the Soviet Union.
whether he is weak or strong, or whether he will survive.
Whether there are substantial factions which might challenge him.
Factions, yeah.
Which might challenge him. Is he secure?